Hi, today we're going to be talking about an episode that was filmed in Manchester back around 2005, 2006, and it was called Rubble at Mill, season 13, episode 3, and I am joined by Stewart Ainsworth. Stewart, hello, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Nice to speak to you, and I think this episode's a really interesting one, isn't it? I love this episode. Obviously, it's slightly biased, being originally from Lancashire.
And I'm from Yorkshire, but let's not disagree straight away.
We're both northern. We'll agree with that. But this is a really particularly interesting one, isn't it? It's the first mill that was ever built in Manchester back in the 1780s. Really early mill, but built by Arkwright. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Well, it was not just the first mill in Manchester. It was the first technological development of the Industrial Revolution in Lancashire. It was the first steam-driven mill in Manchester. It was a pioneer of what became the whole textile manufacturing industry of the north of England through the Industrial Revolution. The technology introduced into changing what would become, up to that point, the cotton industry and the weaving industry was very much almost a cottage-based industry. There were some small sheds with weavers with wooden frames in them, and doing it by hand and by feet. But up to the Arkwright's mill, it was all done at that level. And then suddenly you've got new technology to power steam engines, and they could power the weaving process. And suddenly you went from cottage-based industry to potentially making literally shed loads of money out of these manufacturing processes and automating them through this new technology. So it isn't wrong to say that it was a massive, massive introduction and change, not just in industry, but in all the kind of social aspects of life that came on the back of that. It is almost the birth of the Industrial Revolution in the north of England, I would say that way.
Absolutely. And in fact, actually, there's a fantastic bit where Mike Neville, I think in the episode, says, it's a monumental find. And he actually, to quote him, this is where the modern world begins. It really brings it home, doesn't it?
It does. I think it's quite funny because this programme, to me, I remember it at two levels. One is that all that excitement of that industrial archaeology, as we like to call it, the archaeology of that Industrial Revolution, technology and buildings, new processes. That's really exciting. But at the other hand, to me, it's the changes in society that came along with it. Society was changed in a way it has never been changed before. Suddenly, you've got places like Manchester and Leeds, which were, they were not much bigger than the large villages, quite frankly, in the late 18th century. If you look at maps of that period, they're relatively small places. And if you look at the maps 40 or 50 years after Arkwright's mill arrived, suddenly it was like bacteria breeding on a petri dish. You could see houses and mills sort of appearing everywhere. The whole landscape changed, and of course the lives of the people who worked in those mills changed enormously as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing there is, it changes so quickly. There's a bit in the programme where looking at an early map, as you just say, of Manchester, and then looking at 150 years later. So it's like within a lifetime, really, isn't it? It changes. That must have been so dramatic to people that lived there, that were kind of used to this almost rural way of life. Suddenly for it to stop becoming a town, a city, must have been really quite a poignant moment in time.
I think so. I think it's one of those curious to me that there's almost a sort of a dark side to it. When you read history books and listen to, and even some of the narrative that was on the programme, that we were looking at the houses that some people worked and lived in, as well as the factory and so on. And it was all sort of, oh, it's awful, it's damp, people living in cellars, this stuff. Yes, it was. But there was another side to that period as well, which often isn't talked about a great deal, and it offered a tremendous opportunity for people to earn more money, to learn new trades. For a lot, even the quality of their living improved by moving into these new industries, and it tends to get forgotten to some extent, I think. And there was a tremendous liberation for a lot of people as well, who were up to that point have been fossilized into very small communities, very small rural communities, very fixed ideas about life, and often for women in particular, a very narrow gender-based society. I know this sounds a bit deep, but I often think that we see it as too dark a period because of how it eventually ended up. But when it started, this new technology, these new opportunities for employment, suddenly there were new opportunities for women to work as well, which they never had before. A lot of wives could go out and earn money, for instance.
It really did change people's lives. You've got that, as you say, that sort of rural life. And I think you've got women perhaps working in more traditional worlds, not necessarily working as in going to a factory, which is about to start in terms of the Industrial Revolution, but they're still doing things. They're still working really hard. But I think, as you say, they're encouraged. People are then, families are encouraged to move to the towns, to the cities for what is perceived to be a better life. But I think later on, that's when the conditions deteriorate, isn't it, really? And that's kind of in the 1800s, 1880s and around then that...
That's right.
With that particular one there where they're excavated, so you've got Arkwright's mill, and then you've got the house as well associated with it, one of the houses. And that started off as a nice family house, 2 or 3 stories, one family occupying it. But by 1800 odd, it's then being divided up, and there's lots of families living in. So you've got 2 things, as you say. There's this initial excitement and all these opportunities, but then it does kind of like it becomes bigger and scarier, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and there's more money could be made out of it. It became more exploitative by the industrialists as well. And that excavation of that house was a good illustration of that, how it started off with opportunity and better living conditions for potentially, and more income potentially for lots of people. Very quickly it changed and it went the other way, and you're absolutely right about that. And I think the other aspect as well, which we didn't touch on in the programme, which to me is rather interesting, is that because new technology demanded lots of new motive fuels, particularly coal, to fuel lots of other steam engines all over the north of England, particularly, that's when the coal industry expanded as well. And you went from very small, almost individually owned pits, which were quite small scale operations, into the kind of big coal industry that we know today, sort of thing. And then you got the terrible working conditions of children, 6, 7, 8 year old working underground 14 hours a day. The whole world changed from the 1780s up to the early 1800s, and it started off this new utopia almost, and then very soon descended into the dark satanic mills type of environment that we often associate with it.
Yeah, as William Blake's quote, that, isn't it, actually? And I think at the time there were a few people that were kind of objecting to it. So William Morris and people like that were kind of going, "Hang on a minute, this is all going crazy."
Well, it's very interesting. This brings this sort of personal association for me to this program. Is that this was the first steam power mill in Manchester, and where I was born, in a place called Morley in Yorkshire, which had all the ingredients. So there's a woolen industry already established there in the 1780s. Again, a largely cottage-based industry. The first steam powered mill in Yorkshire was placed in my hometown in 1790.
Oh,
Not long afterwards,
yeah.
And that's when my mum started her working career.
Wow.
In that mill, and I can still remember the wheel on the outside of it. That was there until at least the 60s.
Wow.
That first water wheel. And I can see, when we were doing the program in Manchester, I could still visualise this mill called the Crank Mill in Morley, which had a wheel on the outside, the sort of thing we were looking for in the mill in Manchester. So it's quite interesting to have that kind of personal association between the two types of archaeology.
So how did it actually make you feel excavating that then?
It's very, very odd in a way, from sort of arriving and getting going, looking at the maps and having a good walk around, sort of things I usually do when I go somewhere. I very soon realised that what I was starting to do was explore the archaeology of my own family, as it were. Because of that association, I knew I came from an industrial woolen town that had the first steam-driven mill from 1790 in Yorkshire. My entire family, generations, had worked in that mill, right up to the point when I left home. My mother was still working in mills, and suddenly it was an exploration of myself. And which made it doubly interesting. And lots of the things I was hearing other people talk about on the programme, about living conditions, I remember those living conditions. There was one scene I remember where Helen was talking about people living in a cellar in one of the houses. I had friends who lived in a cellar at my junior school. They were kids who went to school with no shoes on, even in the late 1950s. And their family lived in a cellar. And this was perfectly normal to me because that was the town I grew up in. Remember, this is the 1950s, and to think that there were, even at that point, there were still people living in rooms underground. There's virtually no light. One of my closest friends lived in an area just very close to where I live, and they kept a horse in their room downstairs.
Wow.
Yeah. Apparently, because his dad was a rag and bone man. He used to go around with a cart and collect rag and bone stuff. Early recycling enterprise. But the horse was the most important part of the family. Without the horse, it couldn't. And this was in a back-to-back house in an industrial town. This wasn't a stable. It wasn't a peg, and it got priority. They only had one room downstairs, and that's where the horse lived.
Wow, yeah, it's
incredible,
interesting to think, because it's not that long ago, is it? Really,
it isn't. I think all these things that kept coming up during the program. I wasn't seeing bricks and mortar. I was seeing memories that shaped a lot of the places I lived and spent my life in, and people's lives working in these factories. The noise is the thing. I could hear the noise, even though we were in a place in Manchester with no mills working. I could remember the deafening noise that these mills used to make. When you walked by them, you couldn't talk to somebody as you walked by them because all the looms were going, full speed, 24 hours a day, some of them. My mum could lip read with the best of them, because it was the only way that they could talk to each other over the looms.
Yeah.
And my mother was virtually deaf by her later years because of the pounding. It wouldn't be allowed now. And things like that. Just so the whole program for me became very, very a very personal program. It's not often where you get a chance to explore the archaeology of your own life, is it?
Really? Really. It must have been really poignant. I can well imagine, actually. And in fact, actually, it's funny you mentioned about the lip reading, because I was just talking to my Auntie Joyce, and she was talking about her mum, who used to work in a mill in Lancashire, and saying that yeah, all the women learned to lip read because it was so noisy, you just couldn't hear each other. And
Mm.
there's another interesting bit actually in the program because they discover a clog. So it's not as old as it's not the original Arkwright's mill, but it's a Victorian clog. But actually, it's funny because again, my auntie was talking about clogs, and as she was saying, she remembers wearing them to school, and everyone used to wear clogs back then. And
Mm.
you could choose either on the bottoms, you'd either have iron or rubber. As you said, all the kids always used to choose iron because you could make sparks on the clogs when you were walking. But that must be the origin of, the song about Lowery, the kids in the sparking clogs.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, I mean, it's great sort of talking about these things because often, we never got a chance to explore some of the personal things on Time Team. And I remember in that program, the director of the program, I think it was Lucy McDowell. There's a scene that she asked me and Tony to do, just sitting on the seat. That you're talking about my memories of my mum working in the mill and things like that. And oh, this is very different. The whole feel of the thing was very different to talking about myself and my family to Tony, rather than talking about something you see on a map or something that you're detached from. And what it makes me realise a lot, which is quite important really, that to anybody listening now who's relatively young, and to me that's everybody's relatively young, younger than me these days, but it's just to many people, perhaps hear me talk about families all living in one room in a cellar and going to school without shoes and having a horse in the house, all this sort of stuff, which was the stuff of my childhood, is as distant to some people now as the Romans, isn't it? I mean, time is a very difficult concept for people to grasp, but the world hasn't always had the internet, for instance.
Yeah.
Yet there will be, youngsters who are 15, 16 years old who can't imagine a world without a mobile phone and the internet and instantly accessible information or schooling, everybody going to school. All these sort of things that we took for granted when we were young, we just took them for granted. And the conditions that our parents lived in, their parents worked in mills and these awful, which by then had become awful places to work and live in. It's as far back as the Romans or the Neolithic people. You can't imagine what that life was like, and that in a way is why the archaeology and time team, things like that, are ways of continuing to communicate that time is a funny thing, isn't it? Where you can forget something that happened 30 years ago. You can lose it very quickly if you don't understand it.
Yeah.
And I think it opens up all sorts of thoughts about the nature of heritage. Even there are things even from the 60s now which are being scheduled as ancient monuments.
Yeah.
Out there, because they're disappearing fast. It won't be long before there are things that are now commonplace for 15, 16-year-olds now. They'll suddenly find that in 10 to 15 years they might be scheduled even. So I think it's good to explore modern history as well as very old archaeology, but using a good archaeological approach, which is that sometimes if you don't have just human members, sometimes you need physical remnants that are there in the ground as well. And those physical remnants might only be 50 years old, but if somebody's flattened them and got rid of them, that's the only evidence you might have of that activity. So it's good. I think exploring modern archaeology, if you could call it that way, is as important as always chasing for Roman villas and exciting henges and all that stuff that people tend to associate with archaeology. I think exploring modern history and archaeology is just exciting and just as interesting.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that program really kind of brings that home, doesn't it? This episode, very much.
I think so. I mean, there's a person who gets terribly excited by old maps, as you know, with my foible. I'd recommend anybody who's listening to this video to look at maps of the early 19th century and just look at the area around the places they live and just see how different they are. They're even places like Leeds and Manchester and hadn't fully expanded by the time the Ordnance Survey was making its first maps in the 1840s, 1850s. And they are still rural areas with fieldscapes and woodlands and places that now you just see subsumed into big urban complexes with villages with their own village greens and totally different world. And within 50 to 60 years of places like Arkwright's Mill entering the landscape, they changed into the places we now accept as being cities.
Yeah.
They weren't always big cities like that. And just looking at maps, it can just open your eyes to what the landscapes of the north of England in particular, where the Industrial Revolution perhaps had its biggest impact. It just opens your eyes to that period of change and the people's lives who were living in what was a rural landscape. Suddenly, within 40, 50 years, the utopia of this new industry offering new lives, new money, all the rest of it went sour very quickly and turned into what for many, was really a nightmare lifestyle.
I'm just thinking as well in terms of like the how various towns and cities were connecting with each other as well at this time in terms of the industrial landscape. So for instance, you've got things like the Manchester Ship Canal, the Bridgewater Canal, Leeds and Liverpool Canal being built. You've got all these kind of waterways, connecting and transporting coal and goods.
And the railways, and then the railways. I mean, probably the biggest changes in the landscape opened up the railway. Suddenly, not only could you ship your produce along canals and all the goods and the trading, the coal and everything else, the canals opened up. The railways opened up communications, and then suddenly things like the tourist industry developed. Mm-hmm. People could go up and down the country on trains, opened up seaside resorts, started to evolve. And I love the archaeology of seaside resorts as well, places like Blackpool and Bridlington and all these places. Then the industrial workers could go to them for holidays.
I was going to say, you get people going, the mill workers going on charabancs to Blackpool and places like that.
That's right. I had plenty of exciting trips to see the Blackpool illuminations on the charabanc before motorways and things like that. The whole landscape changed. I think the excitement of that period. It must have been a phenomenal period to be alive in many ways. The new technology that was emerging, exploration, and we've got, I suppose, all the things that were going on in what was rapidly becoming the British Empire at that time, and trading as well. I mean, the late 18th century, early 19th century, is a tremendous, probably the biggest change in society that this landscape has changed. Even bigger, I dare to suggest, and much more important than the Roman conquest. I'm very biased about that.
And just finally, I think one of the sort of final touches, because it's great. I love thinking about the archaeological landscape. But there's this, just to sort of really kind of narrow focus it in, one of the finds there that they discover. I won't give it away, but it's embedded into the mortar of this house. And you just think, that belonged to someone who either lived there or was certainly involved with building the houses. And someone who was there at that time when it was all going on, when the Industrial Revolution was literally in its very early days, just starting. So yeah, it was a really sort of poignant bit, I think.
These are the sort of remnants of lives that history doesn't record. We don't get the census returns until the 1820s are probably the earliest, but they really don't become formalised much until the 1830s. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people whose lives have no record, and it's only when there's maybe that one thing left behind in a bit of mortar or under a floor or something like that. These are the only remnants of their lives, which is why I think we all do archaeology, isn't it?
Yeah.
Finding those things and bringing people's lives back, almost giving them life again.
Yeah, absolutely. Stuart, it's been lovely catching up with you as always, and thank you for that very thought-provoking discussion. I think people will really enjoy this episode, and thank you for sharing all your family history with us and your memories. Much appreciated.
Great to see you again, Dani. Even if you are from Lancashire.
Oh, you had to get it in, didn't you? No wrong with Lancashire, I'll have you know, lad. I look forward to catching up with you soon, Stuart, and see you soon.
Bye for now.
Cheers then.
I'm at the very start of a fugu, and it might be that there's more of these tunnels and caverns existing on this site. We're going to be here in September, so please join us then and back us on Patreon so we can do more and more work on these wonderful sites.